All right, this is follow-up to part 2 to contemporary Bible translations, and I wanted to continue on with where we left off. We have talked about the various different types of Bible translations. We talked about a pre-modern word-for-word or formal equivalent, which is the King James Version. And we talked about how that is no longer, it's not a modern translation. And so we look at word-for-word modern translations, the New American Standard and the English Standard. We also talked a little bit about the rise of dynamic equivalent translations, or thought for thought, kind of balancing the word for word and the thought for thought. So I wanted to look at a little bit of a comparison between the various types of translations and point out a few things. So what we have here is going from the King James at the top to the New American Standard, ESV, and which are more of the word for word. NRSV probably a little bit more of that formal equivalent as well, although trying to balance that. Moving then down into the NIV and the CEB, the Contemporary English Bible, and looking at the dynamic equivalent here, and then to a paraphrase in the Message. And let me point out a couple things about these translations. The first thing, if you notice on the King James Version, and this is all from Romans 3:25, the King James Version, the New American Standard, the ESV, and the NRSV all begin their sentences mid-sentence. They begin with this relative pronoun whom, 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 whom. And that is an attempt as a formal equivalent to maintain the form of the Greek text. So if the Greek text does not begin a new sentence there, then the English translation isn't going to begin its new sentence there. But if you look down at the NIV and the CEB, trying to do a little bit more of a dynamic equivalent, they feel the freedom to, look, we're going to start, it's a new thought, we're going to start a new sentence because we're more concerned about the receptor language, and we're more concerned about people reading this and this making sense in English. Now, if you go down to the Message, it's clear it's not looking for formal equivalency, and it's going to expand on a number of those things. Let me point out a couple of other things. You look up here at the King James, NAS, and ESV. If there is one word in the Greek, like the word hilasterion, which is this word up here for propitiation, look at the propitiation, propitiation, propitiation. One word equivalent, that's fine. But as we move down to a more dynamic equivalent idea, you'll see the NRSV and the NIV, they'll translate a single word, like hilasterion, as not a single word propitiation, but sacrifice of atonement. Sacrifice of atonement. CEB, a much more dynamic equivalent, it's the place of sacrifice where mercy is found. That's a whole phrase for one word in the Greek text. So these are a little bit of the differences between the various translations that we have. I want to say a couple things about them, because one of the questions that comes up inevitably is, well, which one is the best? And it really depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, I really like the NIV and the CEB as pew Bibles, Bibles that everybody in a community can get on board with. It spans a nice age range. It spans international English learners. When it comes to studying the text, I think it's always helpful to not only have these Bibles handy, but to also have various other translations to see how other people have rendered this, especially if you have not already engaged in learning Greek or Greek tools. And so if you have the Greek, you can read the Greek and you can translate your own translation. But if you don't, it really does help to see what are the major interpretive questions by comparing translations to each other. So you know that, like this issue of God displayed publicly his son as a propitiation, and then we have a sacrifice of atonement here, that is going to be an interpretive issue. How does that get translated? And then also the idea of what does it mean that he shows his forbearance in sins that he formerly passed over, and what does that mean? You can see the different ways that those are rendered in an English translation, and note that there is an interpretive issue that's going on here. So I would encourage you, obviously we're going to be doing interpretive work. If you have not already had Greek, if you have had Greek, use it. If you've used the Greek Tools class, if you've had the Greek Tools class, use that. I want to see you use it. If not, you're going to have to use a multiplicity of translations to identify what the major interpretive issues are in the original language. And we're going to talk a little bit about that more next week. But I wanted to give you a little bit of an insight here about what are the basic translations and how are they different, and what might we use in the various contexts that we find them. All right, well that concludes our lecture on contemporary Bible translations.